Hello, everyone. My name is Jill Marriage, and I am a graduate student in Museum and Curatorial Studies at Cal State Long Beach and the lead organizer of Forms of Reparations, the Museum and Restorative Justice. This is a virtual symposium that aims to identify the ways in which cultural institutions sustain white supremacy, imperialism, and exploitation. First, Jacqueline Pena, a recent CSULB undergraduate with a BA in art history, will give an acknowledgement.
Thank you, Jill. Before we start, we want to make sure that we take the time to acknowledge that CSULB is located on the sacred site of Pavungna. We acknowledge that we are on the land of the Tongva Gabrileño and the Hashmin Juaneño nations who have lived and continue to live here. We recognize the Tongva and Hashmin nations and their spiritual connections as the first stewards and the traditional caretakers of this land. We thank them for their strength, perseverance, and resistance.
Thank you, Jacqueline. The event was conceptualized by the School of Art Concerned Students of Color and Allies in 2018 and passed to us, making it a collective effort within the School of Art. We'd like to acknowledge our advisors, Nitzan Shked and Julian Meyer-Shapinska, as well as our funding sources, CSULB's School of Art, the Instructionally Related Activities Grant Allocation, Associated Students Incorporated, and the Beal Center for Art and Technology at University of California, Irvine. In this virtual format, we ask that attendees submit questions through the monitored Q&A functions within the Zoom webinar and YouTube live stream platforms to be asked on your behalf during the Q&A portion of the session. All presentations will be recorded and made available for later viewing. I am delighted to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Atreyee Gupta. Dr. Gupta is an assistant professor in the History of Art department at the University of California, Berkeley. She is presently completing Non-Aligned Decolonization, Modernism, and the Third World Project in India circa 1930 to 1960, a book on the artistic and intellectual resonances of the non-aligned movement during the Cold War era and the interwar anti-colonial Afro-Asian networks that preceded it. Other book projects have included Post-War, A Global History, 1945 to 1965, with Oki and Wizar. And her most recent curatorial projects include When All That Is Solid Melts into Air, exploring the intersection of the folk and modern in post-colonial India, co-curated with Lawrence Rinder at the UC at Berkeley Art Museum and Pacific Film Archive. Welcome and thank you for being here.
Thank you, Jill. Thank you so much for the invitation to what is a really timely conversation. And thank you for arranging it at a time that's so precarious for everyone. And it almost seems that we are moving towards greater precarity as the full implications of the time that we are living through begins to sink in. When we first started talking about this program, the talk that I'd conceived was rather different. But what I want to share today, in a way, reflects some of my thinking in the past few months. What I want to share today is, in fact, something that was written less than 6 months ago, and it seeks to confront and contend with what justice means within a longitudinal history of racial conflict, specifically within representation. So I want to start off not in the present though, but sometime around 1955, when writing from Paris, the African-American author and mid-century civil rights activist Richard Wright writes, "I was staring at a news item that baffled me." Oh, and I should start sharing my screen as well, I guess. Is this working? Can you see? Okay. So then based in Paris, Richard Wright writes, I was staring at a news item that baffled me. I bent forward and read the item a second time. 29 free and independent nations of Asia and Africa are meeting in Bandung, Indonesia, to discuss racialism and colonialism. What was this? I scanned the list of nations involved. I began a rapid calculation of the population of the nations listed. And when my total topped the billion mark, I stopped, pulled off my glasses, and tried to think. The meeting that baffled Richard Wright so was the gathering of leaders and delegates of newly independent nations from Asia and Africa and Bandung, Indonesia, in the summer of 1955. Wright continues. And what had these nations in common? Nothing, it seemed to me, but their past relationship to the Western world. This meeting of the rejected was in itself a kind of judgment upon that Western world. Thinking with the notion of restorative justice as foregrounded in the program, Wright's use of the word judgment in this instance doesn't seem entirely misplaced. He intuitively understood the Bandung Conference as a declamation addressed to Western imperialism and its lingering spectre that continued to cast a long shadow over substantial parts of the world and of people. The solidarities forged in Bandung eventually led to the formalization of the non-aligned movement under the leadership of Jawaharlal Nehru of India, Sukarno of Indonesia, Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt, Joseph Broz Tito of Yugoslavia, and Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana at a gathering in Belgrade in 1961. Wright, on his part, was quick to see beyond the immediate political implications of Bandung, and he continues. I called my wife, and when she came into the living room, I said to her, look there, 29 nations of Africa and Asia are meeting in a place called Bandung. Why are they meeting? Read this, I said, giving her the newspaper. Why, that's the human race. Exactly. And that is why I want to go. As an African-American thinker and activist deeply invested in the post-war civil rights movement in the United States, Wright perceived the Bandung Conference as an event whose vectors exceeded the geopolitical borders of the 29 participating nations. Wright's initial reflections were hardly off the mark. Despite internal tensions, the political multilateralism inaugurated at Bandung rendered a deep fissure in the monopoly of Westernism, not just over the definition of internationalism, but also in the discursive delineation of post-war humanism. The intellectual and artistic vectors of this new humanism of the post-war era demands examination. But its resonance for the practice of art history, and the work of institutional critique within the context of the museum still remains little understood and even lesser theorized. Furthermore, the intersections between non-alignment, which in itself was a facet of decolonization, and art has proven notoriously difficult to pass out, as artistic representation rarely offers motifs or subject matter that can be directly related back to non-alignment in any simple way. Then, should we say that non-alignment had little to do with artistic practice? Surely not. But the relationship between creative imagination and political processes of decolonization was necessarily dialectic. As such, they demanded an active viewership. So in the time before us, I want to then take up the invitation of the conference to extrapolate the intersections between art and non-alignment within the mid-century context of decolonization, in the hope that these may illuminate the decolonizing present that we have inherited and we now inhabit, a present in which the question of race, the question of Du Bois's color line, has returned with seemingly irreconcilable force. I want to begin in 1966 in post-imperial London, exactly 5 years after the non-aligned movement was formalized at the second gathering of the newly decolonized countries. In the summer of 1966, a rather peculiar solo exhibition titled Black Art and Other Paintings opened in London's Grosvenor Gallery. The artist in question was F.N. Souza, the South Asian artist then based in London, and Souza would relocate to New York merely months after the exhibition opened. No photograph of the 1966 exhibition can be located. However, based on a recent rehang, we can imagine that upon entering the space of the White Cube in 1966, the viewer encountered the artworks, black rectangles of different sizes, as an immersive whole. At face value, the paintings would have seemed austere, abstract, uniform, as indeed they do when compressed into the flatness of pixels and projection on the screen before us. Seemingly non-representational, they appear to invite contemplating reflection. And because pure color, black more than other colors, was most often described by mid-century European and American critics as a form of negation of worldly values, the paintings would have offered the possibility of a disinterested, even transcendental aesthetic experience. But the promise of transcendence in Souza's paintings were the results of misapprehension. In other words, not transcendence, but the limits of vision. And you may notice how the chairs in the rehang was intentionally turned away from the painting. For if you sat on those chairs, you would really see very little. Underneath the surface of the black canvases lurked landscapes and portraits, whose smidgens became vaguely discernible only after the eyes adjusted to blackness. Seeing through blackness necessitated a kind of funambularist opticality, whose demand bordered on the acrobatic. In order to see the figures embedded in black paint, the viewer had to assume a range of difficult postures and hold them until the angle of light and the angle of vision was suitable for viewing to even begin. Yet, although Souza compelled his audiences to bend and lean sideways in a way that altered the very conditions of seeing, the clandestine figures hidden behind black pigment did not depend on the viewer's cooperation in order to become representation. For the figures had an existence independent of the viewer's vision or bodily contortions. If anything, the complex calisthenics involved in viewing Souza's black paintings only confirmed the impossibility of any unmediated transparency in cognition, while simultaneously organizing the act of seeing around bodily rather than transcendental color fields. In 1966, such an approach to color was shocking for Souza's viewers, for it pushed, on the one hand, against the vexed associations between blackness and primitivism inherited from pre-war European modernism. Think Picasso. And on the other hand, against debates on color and transcendentalism that were unfolding across the North Atlantic. Think Rothko and a host of others. Souza's large corpus of black paintings, about 60 in total, has continued to prove challenging for art historians and curators alike, especially because no other South Asian artist had engaged with the color black in quite the same way. What meaning did black as a color have for an artist like Souza? a post-colonial artist who had come of age in the 1950s. What prompted Sousa to dialogue with and dissent from the dominant discourses of post-war art? And what did the color black have to do with any of this? These questions have an urgency that is both disciplinary and otherwise. As some may be aware, the story of the global history of post-colonial modernisms within which figures like Sousa are placed prominently has received much attention in recent years. To put it very synoptically, scholars have highlighted the ways in which particular strands of North Atlantic modern art came to be embraced, albeit with profound reorientation, by artists such as Sousa and a host of others from dissonant national contexts. This line of analysis has opened up an image of global modernisms as a theater of imagined transnational collectivities, conceptual improvisations, and inventive interpolations. However, this line of analysis has also implicitly positioned global modern art solely in a dialogic relationship with Europe's modernist imaginary. Yet, we know that decolonization had accrued tremendous intellectual force and a wide affective reach, especially after the 1955 Bandung Conference. Common sense suggests that such non-aligned entanglements across the non-aligned worlds, whose geographic coordinates intersected with that of the Third World and later the Global South, disarticulated this presumptive centrality of the proverbial West. But we have little perspective on the ways in which these may have animated artistic vision. Against this conceptual opacity, I propose a conjunctural history that mobilizes pictorial language as a lens to unpack the intersections between decolonization, non-alignment, and artistic expression. Let us return to Sousa's Black paintings to explore the broader stakes of such a proposition. Blackness as a subject of representation in Francis Newton Sousa's oeuvre was first intimated through figuration and color in the 1954 painting, Reclining Nude. The odalisque-like reclining female figure occupies the entire pictorial surface that is otherwise shorn of any embellishment or prop, aside from a deep red and maroon backdrop. The very presence of the figure, not because of its nudity, but because of color, breaks down imagined ideological, political, and social distances between the Black body and its corporeal imprint in the history of art. As scholars have already shown, even after the abolition of slavery in 1848 in France, the Black female body remained configured as an attendant or subservient figure in the works of French artists such as Manet, among others. Think Olympia. Sousa, who received training in European academic art at the J.J. School of Art in colonial Bombay between 1940 and 1945, was introduced to French and German artists by the city's interwar diasporic Jewish intellectual community. He was all too conversant with this art historical trajectory. But having no access to African American art and literature, he could not possibly have known of the positive reconfiguration of the Black body by artists and intellectuals of the Harlem Renaissance in the United States. How then are we to position such a radical uptake on Black bodies by a South Asian artist whose intellectual formation occurred at a far remove from the historical crucible of the Black Atlantic, or even the work of his African American contemporaries? It is worth recalling at this juncture that Sousa had arrived in London from India in 1949 with a Portuguese passport. Sousa's native Goa on the western coast of present-day India was at the time still a Portuguese colony. and would remain so until it was ceded to India in 1961. Having once served as the capital of Portugal's Estrada da India Empire, a territory that stretched from East Africa to Malacca in Southeast Asia, Goa had remained connected to Indian Ocean Portuguese territories through the shared history of Catholic inquisitions, the continued movement of people, objects, and ideas across colonies in Asia and Africa, as well as enduring debates on race and miscegenation and the experience of ongoing colonial domination. For a Portuguese subject, the black color then had a very distinct meaning. Under the oppression of the whites, the black man had cried out in blues, Sousa wrote in a 1955 autobiographical essay. Painted 2 years later, the iconic blue-black figure placed upon the thick white impasto surface in Sousa's Negro in Mourning echoed the tragedy of colonialism as recounted in the dialogic among whites, blacks, and blues in his autobiographical essay, as if the dripping lines of paint were but streaming drops of tears, bodily secretions, embedded as marks of oppression in the viscous materiality of color pigment. Notably, by the time Negro in Mourning was painted, the history of colonial oppression was becoming entangled for Sousa with the lived milieu of post-imperial London, where artists and writers from former colonies, such as South Asia and the British West Indies, found accommodation in crowded bedsits and cramped apartments in neighborhoods like Belsize Square and Notting Hill. Merely months after Negro in Mourning was painted, violence erupted in Notting Hill, not far from Belsize Square where Sousa lived, when a white working class mob led a week-long armed attack on West Indian migrants in the fall of 1958. As Sousa recollected, I painted Negro in Mourning in London when the race riots flared. I personally think it is one of my best works. Socialist realism maybe, expressionism certainly, but more importantly, Negro in Mourning is close to the bone of man because it is about the color of skin. The plot thickens if we account for a sketch completed in the previous year. The 1957 painting, Negro in Mourning, it turns out, was based on a portrait of the African-American jazz maestro Louis Armstrong, who had arrived in London in the summer of 1956. We can assume that Sousa was becoming more familiar with the African-American civil rights discourses as these were being transposed onto the British cultural and political landscape through figures such as Paul Robeson and others. Through such circuitous ambits, Sousa was also finding bonhomie with diasporic Caribbean intellectuals such as Samuel Selwyn, whose 1956 novel, The Lonely Londoners, was an extensive mediation on racial blackness and the color black. On this account, the following monologue, directed to his own skin by the protagonist Galahad in Selwyn's novel, is exceptionally telling. Writes Selwyn in a distinctly Creole diction, and I quote, "And Galahad watched the color of his hand, and talking to it, saying, 'Color, is you that cause all this, you know?' So Galahad talking to the color black, as if a person, telling it that it is not he who causing botheration in the place, but black, who is a worthless thing for making all that trouble. Black, you see, what he caused to happen yesterday? I went to look at that room that Ram tell about in the gate. And as soon as the landlady see you, she say, the room let already. She ain't even giving me a second chance to say good morning. And why the hell you can't change color? It's not what people don't like," Galahad goes on to say. "It's the color black." The emphasis on the color black is telling, as is the accentuation of the social transgressions that, according to Salvan's Trinidadian protagonist Galahad, was perpetuated by it. But herein also lay a confounding representational paradox, one that substantially concerns Sousa. Color, which was often believed to be subservient to line, form, and composition, had remained conspicuously absent in post-war modernist art historical analysis until the 1970s, at least in the North Atlantic worlds. But more than any other color, it was black that was caught in a condition of double erasure. Most theorists of modern Western art in the 1950s considered black to be a non-color, and therefore relevant only as a shadow, an obverse of true colors, or better still, a negation of color. While I cannot dwell in any depth on the complexity within the art history of color, let me just say that many of the painters with whose work Sousa was perhaps the most familiar had eliminated the color black even from shadows, choosing instead to simulate the effect of darkness by combining blues, greens, and reds. According to Sousa, Renoir disliked the achromatic color so much that he compared a spot of black to a hole in the painting. And at the other end was the history of European modernist primitivism, which implicitly collocated the color with the naive, the infantile, the uncivilized, the savage, and the barbaric. This is a history with which we are all too familiar by now. This history, however, was sharply offset by the implacable centrality of blackness in a very different register of intellectual thought and practice. For the color black was already interpellated by the energies of decolonization. Initiated by Senghor, Césaire, and Damas in Paris, the negritude movement had already marshaled the negative energies implicit in a term like negre to enunciate a new dialectic of Black consciousness well before the middle of the Second World War. Well before the beginning of the Second World War, I'm sorry. Sousa himself encountered negritude only in the 1950s, not through Senghor, Aimé Césaire, or Damas, but through the French existentialist Sartre. When Sousa first met Sartre in Paris, the English translation of Black Orpheus, Sartre's extended critical essay on negritude, written in 1948 as an introduction to a major anthology of negritude poetry, had just been published. Black is a color, Sartre had affirmed, and liberty is the color of the night. Sartre's delineation of the color black as the only viable praxis of revolution in the 20th century was perhaps most generative for Sousa, who had separated from the Communist Party in 1948, but was progressively becoming more and more steeped in Marxist and anti-imperial intellectual movements during his London years. As we will see, for Sousa, the color black mattered, and it mattered in more ways than one. In the 1950s, the color black became more and more central to Sousa's palette, in turn fusing representational concerns with questions of race, imperialism, class, and keeping the Goan context in mind, caste oppression. Sousa's life-size 1959 painting Crucifixion, for example, depicted Christ not in the form of a fair-skinned beatific icon, but as a misshapen black figure wearing marks of brutalization. In this instance, the coloration of the sacramental body was especially significant. For unlike the Iberian colonial worlds of Spanish America and the Philippines, where the Black Christ, Cristo Negro, or the Black Nazarene, enabled indigenous communities to radically refashion Christianity in their own image, the color black was already internal to the dynamics of Hindu caste oppression in pre-colonial Goa. Then in Goa, where Sousa spent his childhood, the color had a very different density, and indeed ciphered a very different notion of marginality and oppression. As others have shown, Portuguese proselytization in Goa strategically assimilated pre-existing social hierarchies ordered around caste or varna, literally color, which historically allocated blackness to lower castes, slaves, and other purported enemies of the fair-skinned upper caste Aryans. Such epidermal hierarchies reflected in representational registers as well. This is clearly discernible in a 17th century Goan oil painting, which shows Francis Xavier, the co-founder of the Society of Jesus, baptizing a low-caste Paravar fisherman. Within this context, the color black, a means of picturing subalternity, was no doubt incredibly charged. Incidentally, Crucifixion was one of the two paintings that Sousa completed in the summer of 1959. The second painting, Nyassa Nigris with Flowers of Thorns, was a direct reference to the ongoing liberation struggle in the British protectorate of Nyassa land, current-day Malawi, in Central Africa, as the title indicates. The British governor of Nyassa land had just declared a state of emergency. And this served as the immediate point of reference. But rather than drawing on symbols with readily legible reference, Sousa assembled a series of vexed cultural associations. The Nyassa figure resembled totemic sculptures removed from the African continent by European explorers and housed in various museums across Europe. Thus, even as the title of the painting contextualized the figure within the geopolitical space of Malawi, the formal constitution of the figure collapsed the distinction between the socio-political body and its cultural manifestation as image in a way that dispensed with any pretension of representational transparency. The bristling thorns emanating from the hair recalled talismanic African sculptures fitted with copper and iron nails, and the fetishization of such objects by modernist primitivists, such as Picasso and others in the pre-war years. At the same time, the crucifix-like form with protruding thorns ominously piercing the side of the face necessarily entangled the history of modern Western art with the history of colonialism. Sousa's paintings from the 1950s thus imparted a historical sensibility to pictorial surface by consolidating a range of critical concerns around the color black. His aesthetic philosophy too assembled discrete ideas drawn from seemingly disparate contexts: negritude, Marxism, and the history of colonialism, to shape an aesthetic vocabulary that was entirely his own. British critics, however, failed to make note of Sousa's unconventional approach to blackness, likely due to the ambiguous status of the color in modern art historiography. For most, the nailed martyr was simply quelling. But the point did not escape South Africa-based German-Jewish Uli Baer, whose critical vision was singularly most influential in shaping Nigeria's post-war modernism in lines with the ideals put forward by the founders of the Negritude movement and the Bandung Conference. Notably, the impact of the Bandung Conference had left a deep impact on Baer. When Baer stumbled upon Sousa's Crucifixion and Nyassa Nigris, among other paintings, when he visited an exhibition in London in 1959, he immediately recognized the echoes of Bandung. Returning to Nigeria, he published an important article on Sousa in the Black Phoenix, the cultural magazine whose title, not coincidentally, drew upon Sartre's essay, the same essay that had also animated Sousa's imagination. By drawing upon a wide array of historical sources, Baer believed Sousa had transcended both national and European painterly conventions to develop a new language of expression that not only resonated across colonized and formerly colonized worlds, but also centralized a critique of oppression as such. We may recognize this as an artistic facet of decolonization, one that is worked out not just through iconography, but also in terms of color. It is not as if Sousa stopped using colors other than black. Rather, the paintings that he completed in the early 1960s mark a transition in his chromatic vocabulary. Nowhere is this more palpable than in a 1962 canvas based on Picasso's 1907 Maids of Avignon, a work that was once described by the curator Alfred Barr as the masterpiece of Picasso's Negro period. Sousa's tryst with Maids of Avignon is hardly surprising, given his artistic predilections. Moreover, Picasso's incorporation of African influences in the painting was already a matter of substantial discussion in the 1960s. Writing in 1960, the art historian Robert Rosenblum was echoing a broader scholarly consensus when he wrote that it is exactly this new freedom in the exploration of mass and void, line and plane, color and value, that makes the painting so crucial for the still more radical liberties of the mature years of Cubism. By and large, mid-century discussions on the work largely cohered around its structural logic, the incorporation of Iberian and African influences, and above all, the historic importance of the work in the formal opening up of the picture plane to abstraction. Sousa, who acknowledged an almost Oedipal fixation with Picasso in an unpublished 1962 interview, was no doubt familiar with these ideas. Then, his retake of the painting was hardly innocuous. In Sousa's 1962 painting, the color black remained restricted to borders and cross-hatchings. He rendered the 5 figures in a ghostly white hue against a muddy background composed of a mixture of magenta, red, orange, yellow, blue, and green. All the colors listed on Getty's now famous symmetric color wheel. By this time, Sousa was already considering the German philosopher's theory of colors and going by the simultaneous mobilization of Goethe's entire color wheel in the 1962 painting had also summarily debunked Goethe's subjective chromatic allegories as sentimental and pictoriographically untenable. It would appear that he was somewhat more convinced by Goethe's leading opponent, Newton, who had placed the entire emphasis of his scientific color theory on the study of light. But Newton's color wheel was not entirely adequate for Sousa's purposes either, as it did not allocate any function for achromatic black, which absorbs heat and light, or white, which scatters all the visible wavelengths of light. Sousa's solution to this achromatic conundrum was quite novel, as is hinted in a letter written to his friend, the surrealist poet Victor Musgrave, during a visit to India in the summer of 1960. Pressed to describe his experiences to his friend, he confesses that he does not know very much about the political situation, as he was returning to Bombay after 10 long years. But the sun, he writes, is red hot and blazes like hell. Sky, trees, rooftops, roads, and objects in the sun are white with heat. Here, white is already eminent with destructive energy. Speaking to the artist and cultural critic Rashid Areen several years later, Sousa would go as far as to designate white as the color of empire. These comments were not naive or uninformed creative appositions on the part of the artist. The ekphrastic invocation of iridescence, that is color's ability to suffuse the surrounding space in the visual field, in Sousa's 1960 letter clearly belies a sound grasp of color science. In retrospect, this makes Sousa's empirically flawed, idiosyncratic inversion of the heat-absorbent quality of black and the reflective attribute of white telling, especially as he proceeds to visually work out the main issues at stake in the shockingly pale figures central to his 1962 retake of Picasso's Maids of Avignon. In Sousa's painting, all markers of blackness, associative, notional, or otherwise, are seemingly annulled. Unlike the robust presence of the 5 female figures in Picasso, the ones in Sousa's painting are ghostly, almost transparent, weightless, as if evacuated of all substance. The effect of insubstantiality, of course, is compounded by the paleness of coloration. But the appearance of the figures also has something to do with the manner in which the painting was created. Sousa acquired a transparency projector sometime in the early 1960s. With the help of this machine, he started tracing photographic prints on transparency sheets. The endless fragmentation of pre-existing imagery that this new technique engendered had far-reaching implications for his painterly practice. But most significantly, the technique opened up the possibility of approaching the canvas as a site of displacement. This is how one critic who observed Sousa at work described it. The artist selected a page. With a pen and black ink, he swiftly distilled a drawing from the photograph, dispensed with the booklet, and laid the transparency on the horizontal glass of the machine. The light was switched on, and the drawing projected onto the working area. With charcoal, the artist then made a second adaptation over the lines of the first sketch, switched off the projector, and the final drawing was exposed. Sousa pointed out that this was purely a drawing. In case of a painting, the charcoal base would have been omitted and colors substituted. The process of excerpting, recombining, and rendering transparent enabled a painterly method of endless mutations and disarticulations that help to render hollow, that is, evacuate meaning and power or make absent the given image that served as the artist's point of departure. The 1962 painting was made through this new technique of transparency and projection. But the act of rendering transparent Picasso's Maids of Avignon, the most important single pictorial document that the 20th century has yet produced, according to one contemporaneous critic, certainly constituted a form of pictorial iconoclasm in itself. But the invocation of a park in Belsize Square, where immigrants from South Asia and the Caribbean, including Sousa, lived, in the title of the painting was perhaps even more incendiary. For the loud and piquant public presence of immigrants in cafes, theaters, and parks were perceived as a transgression of the British social order, as is chronicled in Selwyn's 1956 novel, The Lonely Londoners. Ironically, Picasso had initially titled his own painting The Brothel of Avignon, and critics in the 1960s often portrayed the two darker figures with African masks as more grotesque, more barbaric than the comparatively benign, light-skinned Iberian prostitutes in the center, and more likely to be contagion-ridden. This is what William Rubin had to say about the two darker figures in a 1983 article published in the Art Bulletin. We sense the thanatophobia in the primordial horror evoked by the monstrously distorted heads of the two whores on the right of the picture, so opposite to those of the comparatively gracious Iberian courtesans in the center. One can hardly imagine the fear, the shock, and the awe these heads must have imparted in 1907. And more to the point of race and representation, Rubens continues, These African faces express more, I believe, than just the barbaric character of pure sexuality noted by Steinberg. They finally conjure something that transcends our sense of civilized experience, something ominous and monstrous, such as codes discovered in the heart of darkness. Thus, even as the painting marked for art history that precise juncture of a paradigmatic shift from contextual to formal exegesis, so central to 20th century modernism, the terms of critical ekphrasis internalize stereotypes long associated with darker skinned peoples. That Sousa opted to magnify Picasso's two darker figures and make the rest diminutive in contrast is surely not coincidental. Thinking transversally, we could even say that the painting was about the color black. For despite its absence, the presence of the color was made implicit via recourse to an art historical imaginary surrounding the maids of Avignon, worked out formally by magnifying the darker figures of Picasso's painting and grounded in space through the precise geographic coordinates of Belsize Park. Perhaps the absence of the color black was also a sardonic commentary on racial discrimination, as the painting was conceived and executed in the same year that the Commonwealth Immigrants Act, an anti-color legislative act that substantially curtailed the rights of immigrants from Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean, was passed in the British Parliament. The act codified immigration along racial lines that tacitly conflated the color of skin with urban discontent brought about by pressure on housing, unemployment, racial conflict, and perceived urban decay. As a site of intersectionality, the color was then progressively becoming overdetermined, indeed overburdened. The very word color now mobilized an entire social, cultural, and political system of epidermal-based exclusion based on a logic of the ocular. Criminals and degenerates, it was argued, looked a certain way. To be sure, the exclusionary optics of color impacted Sousa's chromatic thought, prompting him to approach the subject of the color black by other means. In the 1950s, Sousa had frequently mobilized the color black as a clearly delineated visible mark on an encumbered physical trace on the pictorial surface. The paintings from the early 1960s indicate that the artist had begun to think of the color as somewhat more than only a sum of pigments. But still, the color black worked as a sine doce, as if it could neither shake off its political imago nor exceed it. Therefore, Sousa wished to exceed opticality and surface, to activate blackness otherwise, to make the color black the primary subject of representation. Only with the black paintings, which Sousa began in 1964, does the color black become agentive as a pictorial proposition. The color black is the subject of Sousa's monochromatic black art series. But not all of Sousa's monochromes are uniformly black or monotonously matte. One canvas has a glossy reflective surface, another has a lighter matte black hue, a third is rendered with a minor black-brown tint, and a fourth, reproduced here, is a mixture of matte and gloss. Such variations withstanding, the color black is the subject of the paintings. And it is in this sense that the entire body of works also appear at the first glance to be non-representational mediations on color, the seemingly confirming to the highly mediatic and ocular emphasis in formalist discourses that dominated critical lexica in the mid-decades of the 20th century. This ostentatious mediatic focus, however, constitutes an elaborate subterfuge of the very same critical emphasis that the paintings appear to uphold. For the putative emptiness that meets the eye at the initial glance, is but an ocular misapprehension, as figural imagery lurk immediately beneath the seemingly ungiving black surface. Although the figurative renditions bear stylistic homology with the works completed in the previous years, there is nonetheless a crucial distinction between Sousa's previous experimentations with the color black and the black paintings of the mid-1960s. Figures had been represented as images ensconced within the limits of the canvas in the artist's earlier paintings. Their address to the viewer had also been primarily optical. It is not as if the figures in the black paintings now refuse such an address. It is just that the painter has become far less acquiescent of the so-called disinterested gaze. Most notably, the black paintings resist vision. When I first encountered Sousa's black paintings, I was struck not by the paintings, but by my own inability to see. This resistance to vision is what activates the black paintings, as the barely discernible smidgens of embedded presence beneath the black pigment demand a very different kind of embodied looking. I twisted, turned, bent, until the black forms rendered in thick impasto strokes surfaced, as if out of their own violation, once the angle of light and my angle of vision were perfectly aligned. I was finally seeing, but not merely seeing through the eyes. Furthermore, the artist had hidden a second multichromatic layer underneath the thick black surface of some of the paintings. This layer has become visible only recently, after some of the canvases have developed craquelure across their cutinous exterior, as the black paint layers have aged and shrunk back to reveal a subterranean anthropomorphism, a body within a body. The specific method of embedding and layering the body of the canvas, conceptualized here as both surface and depth, the body of color, and the colored body, perhaps derived from the technology of transparency and projection, which necessarily made the process of mark making striated for the artist. But I want to emphasize that this method of embedding and embodiment is not simply a result of painterly procedure. Rather, it indicates a cautious employment of bodily comportment. Consider a 1964 documentary photograph of the artist at work on a black painting. Sousa crouches on the ground, arms extended for the benefit of the camera, in a gesture that clearly has more to do with staging than it has to do with painting. Sousa returned to such documentary photographs of himself with insistent abandon as he began to cut and splice photographs in his sketchbooks in the early 1960s. As visible in one folio, he also refurbished such photo compilations with a serial structural logic that implicitly drew into the visual quotient his own body. The photographic compilation anticipated the chromatic seriality of the black paintings, while the cover of the Black Art and Other Paintings catalog reenacted the structural logic of the photographic folio, the latter originally envisioned as a private exercise in photo collage. Of course, there was obvious differences in what the photographs actually showed. The ones in the photo compilation recorded artistic process and thus belonged to a documentary genre, while the one on the cover of the catalog is a single black and white formal portrait of the artist, now cut into 16 uneven squares and laid on a rough grid. Aside from such distinctions, the primary additive element in the catalog is a seemingly bland silver coating that, if scratched away by an inquisitive viewer, reveals two dark figures, fully covered in a glossy plastic polyvinyl chloride outfit, flanking the artist. The cover of the exhibition catalog was designed by Sousa, and as such, it elucidates a peculiar dialogic between the ocular and the corporeal that the black paintings also instantiate. Precisely how this structural logic springs from the technology of transparency projection is difficult to extrapolate, as Sousa did not expound upon this matter. But the connection can certainly be sustained by way of juxtaposition. Such juxtapositions relentlessly return us to the body, the artist's own body, the cutinous quality of the paintings, and the contorted body of the viewer. It is tempting to read into this insistence on the body an oblique reference to Sousa's Paris-based Martinican contemporary, Frantz Fanon, whose profound influence on contemporaneous intellectual thought and decolonial politics is now widely acknowledged. As others have noted, Fanon's delirious array of self-images in black skin white masks were all tethered to imperialist stereotypes of blackness. I was battered down by tom-toms, cannibalism, intellectual deficiency, fetishism, racial defects. Such a sense of the corporeal could not be simply assimilated into the Cartesian distinction between the mind and the body, as consciousness and cognition refracts, in Fanon's terms, in that returning gaze, look a Negro, of the white European. The corporeal body was, for Fanon, the source of an impossibly fractured but critical crucible of a Black consciousness that functioned through a making that was not quite his own. Certain threads of corresponding intellectual strands between Fanon and Sousa have been alluded to by the artist critic and third world theorist Rashida Rein. But in a sense, Sousa's own mediations on Blackness in the Black Art series refuses such a gaze. For the pigmental density in Sousa's Black paintings categorically rejects any visual reckoning with color that proceeds from a generalized dermatological assumption. Moreover, Sousa is not, strictly speaking, an artist of African descent. Then, what he insists upon in place of generality is, as performance studies scholar Fred Morton so wonderfully puts it in a different context, the irredeemable homelessness common to the colonized, the enslaved, and the enclosed. Conceivably, there is no simple way to communicate a chromatic schema that places color at the intersections of the language of art and the language of decolonization, except via the sociability of viewing. The sociability is how the Black paintings work. In the absence of this contact, they retract into the inertness of monochromatic oversaturation, as if parodying the essentializing chromatic valence of the color Black as a non-color, negation of color, stasis, absence. This language of negation is exactly what Ad Reinhardt, another painter of monochromes, used to describe the color Black. But for Sousa, an artist of color, Black was fundamentally kinetic. The color Black stood not for stasis, but for the incalculable rhythm of movement that did not heed any critical protocol that distinguished between aesthetic experience from the experience of the everyday. Consequently, the obstinate opacity presented by the Black paintings was not resolved, but only magnified in photography. When underexposed, the Black figures retroceded into the Black surface. When overexposed, the pictorial surface was distorted by refraction, thus inclining the color Black towards white or gray. Then, the body matters in the Black painting almost as much as the color Black matters for Sousa. If we still believe that transcendence is at all implied in the color Black, then this possibility is all but dispensed in Sousa's Black paintings. We may recall that monochromatic painting, of which Malevich's 1913 Black Square was an early example, has been consecrated in art history as a tangible expression of the subliminal. In 1950s Paris, Sousa's contemporary, Yves Klein, had already adopted the idea of pure realms of color and color as a spiritual realm. In New York, the color field painter Mark Rothko insisted on color's ability to express basic human emotions, tragedy, ecstasy, doom, and so on, and to precipitate a transcendental encounter with infinity. In hindsight, The association of the color black in post-war art with infinity, purity, spirituality, and transcendence may appear universal. But in insisting that his viewers twist, bend, and turn, Souza harbored an aspiration of a very different sort. Let us not forget that when wielded by the disenfranchised in the second half of the 20th century, the color black, the negritude poetics of the color black, the black of the Black Panthers, the black flag of dispersed anarchist groups across the world, functioned as chromatic contractions of resistance. Thinking in terms of intersecting vectors of art and decolonization, then demands a constant alertness to such contractions, so that the story of art and non-alignment can be made present in scholarly and curatorial practices once again. Only then can we assess a global history of restorative justice that is not aligned with the stories that we tell already in the hallowed halls of the still very white cube. Thank you.
Thank you. We're going to jump into some questions. So everyone, if you have questions, please go ahead and put them in the Q&A box on the Zoom webinar, or I know the YouTube live stream has a little bit of a delay, but we have a Q&A section on there as well. Let's see. We have one. We know intersectionality as a political term born of legal studies. Can you elaborate a bit on how you use it in art analysis?
We have tended to think of art analysis as in fundamentally formal terms. But often social art history is also considered the context. Yet at no given point have we let go of our pictorial assumptions that continue to embed questions of line, color, composition, and pictorial effect within a history of painting itself. Intersectionality is useful when thinking of art and decolonization, precisely because it exposes the deeply interrelated nature of artistic practice and processes that are conventionally considered outside it. For example, immigration laws. For example, border policing. For example, questions of citizenship. For example, questions of loss of citizenship. So intersectionality, in the sense that I'm using it here, seeks to posit artistic language as indispensable and indeed indistinguishable from these other processes that we have conventionally considered outside of art. So I am saying that the color black in this instance has a lot to do with immigration law. It has a lot to do with processes of decolonization, which were political, questions of international collaborations among the non-aligned countries, and so on.
Thank you. You spend time comparing Souza with Picasso, who is a contested figure currently in art history for his personal opinions and lifestyle. And when we look at these completely black paintings, these monochromatic works, it brings to mind Malevich, who is known for his use of the color black, the pigment black. How would you compare, in the same way you did with Picasso, these two works, given that we're focusing on the pigment and the use of the pigment as a subject matter?
So Sousa, like many artists from the so-called third world or the global south, um, was nearly obsessed with Picasso. Um, it was almost a kind of an Oedipal relationship. Um, and it was so in part because, um, at least in the mid-centuries, or rather right up to the mid-centuries, Picasso had become, in a way, um, the fountainhead of 20th century art, if you will, and crucial flashpoints in this being Guernica and the Maids of Avignon. And this was so not just for artists of the global south, but this was so for European and American artists as well. We need only to think of the various offshoots of Cubism, both in the United States and in Europe. So the obsession with Picasso stems from Picasso's place within within art history, or at least the way in which it was understood in the mid-centuries. In fact, the way in which it was understood not very long ago, until the 1990s. I can direct your attention to several articles, and all published in the Art Bulletin, that speak of the sexuality, the contagion, the barbaric faces of the mask-clad figures in Maids of Avignon. But somehow the so-called Iberian figures, who are lighter skinned, are spoken of in very different terms. So really what is at stake here then is color, but epidermal coloration as well. And Sousa and these were the debates around Picasso that Sousa would have been all too familiar with. And that when that comes together with a very particular configuration of the color black within immigration reform in Britain in specific, where color begins to stand in for very many things. Then it becomes easy to understand why Sousa keeps returning to Picasso. Malevich, as you very rightly point out, Malevich would have been perhaps a somewhat more interesting figure for someone like Sousa, precisely because Malevich was thinking about color qua color. But I want to also point out that was never Sousa's intention. For Sousa, the color black is the body. It is the so-called barbaric body. And moreover, Sousa never imagined himself as an abstractionist. In that sense, the black paintings are also not abstract works per se. There is a single canvas among the 60 odd works that is truly abstract. So what is transpiring here then is a kind of painterly logic that refuses to distinguish between colorless pigment and colorless skin. Or perhaps I shouldn't say refuses to, in fact cannot. It's fundamentally interrelated and interwoven. Yeah.
Thank you. Another question. In your lecture, you spoke of the usage of Victorian language and decolonial language in art analysis. Can you define what post-colonial language is to you, and if that is different than Sousa's decolonial language? What kind of analytical language should curators use today in delivering their critical narrative to museum audiences, in your opinion?
I would distinguish between decolonization and decolonial, because decolonization unfolds in a very particular um, in a very particular historical juncture. It has a certain kind of historical density. It accounts for a longer history of colonization. Although decolonial, as imagined by Mignolo and others, um, can trace its genealogy back to decolonization. The language of the decolonial is somewhat more flexible than that of decolonization, if you will. Again, post-colonial, these are all complex terms with rather deep histories. But the term post-colonial specifically pertains to the time after colonialism, as the post in the post-colonial suggests, but it also pertains to a certain kind of engagement with imperial history, or rather colonial history, and a concomitant disengagement or a critical assessment of the Enlightenment project, which shaped the worldviews of intellectuals in the colonies in a way. It shaped disciplines. It shaped the languages in which we speak, write, and think. But decolonial, in my mind, steps outside it of this historical template to begin to at least think of a politics for today. And in doing so, most certainly it draws historical rigor from the past, the post-colonial and the past of decolonization. But it's still distinct from it. It is a space that we can all inhabit. To the question of whether the language of the post-colonial or the language of the decolonial is more appropriate for a museum space, well, it depends on what is being. It depends on the terms of the conversation, really. It depends on what is being interrogated. It depends on what. It depends on the subject matter. It depends on what the curator seeks to convey. For example, if one were to say restage or do a retake on Souza's black painting exhibition of 1966, we would have to account for the immediate context of decolonization. And this was political decolonization. This was time after colonialism. This was the post-colonial nations coming together to articulate their own sovereign subject position within a Cold War system. The non-aligned countries refused to align with either USSR or United States, but rather chose to stake out their own position within a very charged political field. If we were to restage Souza's 1966 painting, we would have to account for that context of decolonization. So it depends on what the material is, or rather what the material asks even.
Thank you. Another question, can you give us an example of how art intersects with immigration law, just to make the concepts a little bit more concrete?
To put it very, very simply, art is produced by artists, and immigration law works upon the bodies of the artist. So immigration is, for some, a very direct experience. It is one that, it is your everyday. And immigration law is only one component. There are other kinds of everyday acts. So the artist who produces work is not distinct from the art from the figure upon whose bodies certain kinds of discriminations are perpetuated, or whose body is controlled by a cluster of laws. So this is so the relation is very, very straightforward. And if we think of Asian American artists, for example, especially those working in the post Pearl Harbor years, even there, the relationship between legal processes, questions of citizenship, and pictorial language is very, very direct. I'm thinking of artists like Yunji, I'm thinking of artists like Ishigaki, and a host of others.
Thank you. In talking about actually curating an exhibition in present day, utilizing artists like Souza and the topics in which they're talking about, there's still an issue that we're confronted with, that museums may not represent them well, or represent them properly, or represent them within a framework in which the decolonial effort of recognizing the body of the skin and the body of the artist and the law in which it is both socially and politically constricted and confined. How do you think a museum could approach curating D'Souza's work and showing, or excuse me, Souza's work, and showing it in a way that actually respects and furthers the conversation rather than limiting and burying it amongst the rest of the noise?
Well, I could speak to how the rehang of the 1966, a fairly recent rehang, in fact, of the 1966 exhibition worked, and that is actually what we're looking at on the screen. The curators opted to let the paintings do the work, in the sense that they opted to hang the works without additional explanations. Certain, as you can see, there aren't very elaborate wall texts, and chose to address some of the complexities in the exhibition catalog. And so, and in this instance, that worked as a fairly effective strategy, precisely because the paintings themselves take you by surprise. At the first glance, you see them and you think you know them. You are reminded of very many things: Malevich, Klein, Rothko, works that we are all too familiar with. Yet, the figures that are embedded in the black surface catch light, and you're aware of the fact that there's something more to see, yet you can't see them. It is a moment of utter terror, simply because our expectation when you walk into a white cube such as this is to see art. Why am I confronted with something that I do not see? And then you do your calisthenics, you twist, you bend, and you try to see. So it is a kind of an active viewing, and that's precisely what Souza demands, at least in this body of works. And in this particular instance, the curators, that was what the curators wished to convey. That the work was embedded within a kind of a context of decolonization, a context of increasing anti-immigrant sentiment, and increasing race riots, in Britain was not so much the point. The point was creating that kind of terror, which in a way transforms the viewer, herself or himself, precisely because you're being asked to do something, rather than sit back and contemplate. And so that can, in fact, at least to my mind, be an effective strategy. Because in no given exhibition, and this is true of books as well, you cannot cover all bases. You cannot you can complicate the story only to a certain point, unless you want your entire wall to be filled up with texts. But to place the viewer in a position of complete terror or discomfort or confusion, that may cause the viewer to think and think again, to my mind, does a certain kind of discursive work, which is priceless. Only exhibitions can do that. I can in a talk show you Sousa's black paintings, but projected thus, it's just a black surface. Yet the works are not quite as effective when seen in this manner. It demands the sort of socialization involved in twisting, bending, and doing that in a public space, doing that kind of awkward act in a place when one is least expecting to do it. So in this instance, that I thought was an exceptional strategy, and but again, it depends on what the object wants and what one is seeking to convey. In a more historiographically oriented exhibition, it is conceivable to include a plethora of additional or supplementary material, and that too has been done very, very effectively in several exhibitions. So, to my mind, it ultimately depends on what message one wishes to convey and what you want the viewer to walk away with.
Thank you. Next question is, what are the consequences in unlearning colonial and modern knowledge production and relearning a decolonial and post-colonial approach for the art and cultural institutions and education?
Well, it involves unlearning to begin with, and forgetting, or rather letting go of all our expected methodological conceptual tools, because in part what we have inherited, not just in the museum but also in the academy, we have inherited a institutional structure and a disciplinary structure, a set of methodologies, a set of language that already that in a way come out of the post-Enlightenment formation of disciplines in Europe, and many of the stereotypes, many assumptions are already embedded in the language that we've inherited. Think, for example, of abstraction. When we say abstraction, we think of a certain thing. We think we know what it is, because there is a history of abstraction that we do know. Yet that history is a predominantly Euro-American history. So this is only to say that decolonization necessarily entails returning again and starting again from ground zero to not just to relearn, but also to forget and start again. And this is not a process that's ever simple or ever easy. And I also don't believe that this is a process that could ever be completed, precisely because there will always be something to unlearn. It is fundamentally a process of experimentation, whereby one is trying to figure out a history again, put together the pieces back again, and we may get it wrong many times.
Thank you. I think the last question we might have time for today. The art world is embroiled in debates around the postponement of the Philip Guston exhibition. What is your opinion about this?
May I turn back to the person who asked the question and ask for their opinion first?
I believe they're listening, so we'll see.
But you're not able to unmute the person.
I don't believe I am, given our restrictions with our university, unfortunately.
Well, it is interesting to me that with every museum controversy, we come away with an interpretive lens and a conceptual tool that is appended yet again in another museum controversy. And in the recent past, in the past few years, there have been several such controversies, right? And many have taken various different shapes. But it also seems to me that one aspect that we seem to have largely forgotten or not accounted for is the need to historicize. We have come to a point where museum practices and curatorial practices have insistently left, have sought to, in a way, separate themselves from artistry and critical thought. And there is, within the larger art world, a certain kind of discomfort or unwillingness to think long and hard about what criticality entails. And one hears this, and I realize my answer is very, very oblique, but here it is. But one hears this refrain over and over again. Artistry has little to offer the contemporary art world or contemporary curating, or an exhibition was too intellectual. But if we do not, if we are unwilling to think historically and think and do the kind of discursive work that critical thinking demands, then projects and processes of decolonization runs into a rut, precisely because decolonization sees this criticality. And this is something that one could think through with post-colonial theory in particular, whereby every position that post-colonial scholars have taken or adopted have been thought, rethought, and some have even traced back arguments that they have made in the past. Think, for example, of the Subaltern Studies Collective, who have engaged in an almost unrelenting process of self-criticality, often questioning their initial positions to begin with. The many museum controversies surrounding exhibitions consistently remind me of the need to return to discursive thinking, something that seems to have gone out of museum practices. Yes, that's my answer.
Thank you, Dr. Gupta, for joining us today. It's been an absolute pleasure to hear you speak.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me, and it's been a tremendous pleasure to be here, and congratulations for organizing what is a wonderful spate of programs.
Thank you. Thank you also to all of our attendees. This is the second in a series of lectures and panels that will be taking place over the next 2-ish weeks at this point. Coming up later this evening, we will be hearing from members of Decolonize This Place on art and activism as it pertains to their work regarding museums. And on Wednesday, we are joined by Alma Ruiz for a keynote presentation on the potential of Los Angeles art museums. For the full schedule and registration, visit our website, www.wedemandreparations.com, and reach out to the organizers directly via our email if you have any questions. Thank you, everyone.
Whoa.